February 25th, 1964. Miami Beach, Florida. A 22-year-old from Louisville. Kentucky steps into the ring as a 7-1 underdog. Across from him stands Sonny Liston, a fighter, so feared that grown men had quietly reconsidered their careers rather than face him. 6 rounds later, Liston doesn't answer the bell. Cassius Clay is the new heavyweight champion of the world. But the fight itself isn't what the history books remember most. 2 days later, the champion makes an announcement that will define him far more than any punch he ever threw. He has joined the Nation of Islam. Weeks after that, he goes further still. Cassius Clay, he says, is a slave name. I didn't choose it, and I don't want it. I am Muhammad Ali. The backlash is immediate and furious. Sports writers refuse to use a new name for years. But Ali isn't performing rebellion for its own sake. He's making a historical argument, using his own identity as the evidence. The name Clay, he's saying, was never a neutral inheritance. It came from Cassius Marcellus Clay, a 19th century Kentucky slaveholder whose family once owned Ali's ancestors. It was a brand, not a birthright. What Ali couldn't have known in 1964 is just how far back that history actually reached, or how strange, layered, and specific the true story of his ancestry would turn out to be once modern genealogy and DNA testing finally caught up to it, decades later. Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. was born January 17, 1942, in Louisville, to Cassius Clay Sr. and Odessa Grady Clay. His father was a sign painter and muralist, a proud, expressive man with a flair for performance that his son would inherit in full. He'd been named, in a strange twist of Kentucky history, after Cassius Marcellus Clay the Elder, a 19th century politician who was, by the standards of his era, a walking contradiction. He was an outspoken abolitionist. He also enslaved people. His name ran down through a black Louisville family for generations, afterward a permanent record of that contradiction, carried by people who never asked for it. Ali's mother, Odessa, was quiet, devoutly religious, and by every account the calm center of the household. Ali spoke about her with open devotion for the rest of his life. And her maiden name, Grady, carried a very different kind of history. It's an Irish surname. Everyone in the family knew that much. What they didn't fully know, for most of the 20th century, was exactly how it had gotten there. Here's where the story usually gets told wrong. A lot of retellings turn this into an unsolved mystery, a nameless ancestor lost to time, a DNA result pointing toward Ireland with no story behind it. That's not what actually happened. The real story is better, because it's specific, documented, and as it turns out, is a genuinely moving ending. Genealogical research traced Odessa Grady Clay's family back to a man named Abe Grady, sometimes recorded as Abe O'Grady, who left the town of Ennis, in County Clare, Ireland, sometime in the 1860s. He made his way to Kentucky and married a free African-American woman. Their family took root there. Down the line, their descendants became Ali's mother's side of the family. This was a rumor pieced together after Ali became famous. It held up under real scrutiny. In 2009, Ali, then in his late 60s, already living with Parkinson's disease, traveled to Ennis, County Clare, to see his ancestral home for himself. He was greeted like visiting royalty. Thousands lined the streets. The town council made him the first honorary freeman of Ennis in its long history, and unveiled a plaque at the site of the old Grady homestead on Turnpike Road. Ali, the man who had spent a lifetime being told exactly what he was, and wasn't allowed to claim as his own identity, stood in a small Irish town, and was simply, warmly, claimed as one of theirs. There's no mystery woman lost to history here. There's a documented Irish immigrant named Abe Grady, a marriage in Kentucky in the years after the Civil War, and a homecoming, over a century later, that Ali got to experience himself, in person, while he was still alive to feel it. The Grady line explains part of Ali's ancestry, but it's only one branch, and the branch that would eventually produce the most remarkable discovery of all wasn't on his mother's side, it was on his father's. Cassius Clay Sr.'s own paternal grandparents were John Clay and Sally Ann Clay. Family oral history passed down through Ali's aunt. Eva held that Sally was originally from Madagascar, off the coast of East Africa, an unusual and specific claim that never made it into any official record, the way so much of enslaved ancestry never did. That's the wall every Black American genealogist eventually hits. Enslaved people were recorded as property, not as people cataloged by value, not by origin. Names, nations, languages, erased at the moment of capture, then erased again at every sale afterward. For most families, the paper trail simply stops sometime in the early to mid-1800s, and nothing on the other side of that wall can be recovered through documents alone. For decades, that's where Ali's paternal story stopped too. Then, in 2018, 2 years after Ali's death, it didn't. The breakthrough didn't come from a television crew or a research institute. It came from a relative. Keith Winstead, one of Ali's third cousins and an amateur genealogist, had been quietly working on a family tree for years, using consumer DNA testing to fill in gaps that paper records couldn't. Ali and his wife Lonnie had, years earlier, provided DNA samples as part of an effort to raise awareness around Parkinson's research samples that ended up making this discovery possible. What Winstead found, and what DNA testing later confirmed, was this. Through his paternal grandmother, Edith Greathouse, Muhammad Ali was a great-great-great-grandson of a man named Archer Alexander. If that name isn't familiar, it's worth slowing down for, because Archer Alexander's own story is extraordinary in its own right, and it makes her one of the strangest, most fitting inheritances in American history. Archer Alexander was born enslaved in Virginia, later held in Missouri during the Civil War. In 1863, he learned that Confederate soldiers were planning to sabotage a bridge that Union troops intended to cross. At enormous personal risk, he walked 5 miles in the dark to warn them. The information got through. The bridge held. Union soldiers' lives were very likely saved. When word got back to his enslaver that Alexander had tipped off the Union Army, he had to run immediately and for good. He fled to St. Louis, where abolitionists sheltered him. He is remembered for a line attributed to him that captures exactly what kind of man he was. Go for your freedom if you dies for it. Alexander eventually gained his freedom and became something more than a footnote to the war. Abolitionist William Greenleaf Eliot wrote an entire book about his life, called The Story of Archer Alexander, From Slavery to Freedom. And when the time came to design the Emancipation Memorial, the statue that still stands today in Lincoln Park, in Washington, D.C., depicting a formerly enslaved man rising up, chains breaking at his wrists, it was Archer Alexander's likeness that was chosen as the model. He is, quite literally, cast in bronze as the face of American emancipation, and Muhammad Ali is his great-great-great-grandson. Sit with that for a second, because it's a genuinely remarkable coincidence of history, the kind no screenwriter will be allowed to invent without someone calling it too neat. The man whose statue represents the moment slavery ended in America turns out to be the direct ancestor of the man who, a century later, became the most famous Black American on earth by refusing, over and over, to accept the limits other people tried to place on him. Refusing a name. Refusing a war he didn't believe in. Refusing to be quiet or careful or grateful in the way he was expected to be. Ali's daughter, Maryam, put it simply when the discovery became public. Her father would have loved knowing about the connection. He'd spent his whole life saying long before he had any proof that there was a line running all the way back through slavery to people worth being proud of. In 1980, he told the New York Times he hoped one day to dig up everything that could be found about the people he came from. He didn't live to see this particular answer, but it turned out he'd been right to go looking. And it wasn't only Ali's paternal line that carried a form of resistance in its DNA. Archer Alexander walked toward danger to warn soldiers he'd never met at a moment when the cost of being caught was almost certainly death. More than a century later, his descendant refused to walk to a war he considered unjust at a moment when the cost of that refusal was his title, his income, and very nearly his freedom. Different centuries, different battles, but the same instinct, running down through a bloodline neither man ever knew connected them. So what did the science actually confirm when all of it is put together honestly? Not a single, clean story. Not the version where an African identity was simply stolen and needs to be reclaimed whole, and not the version where a mysterious, unknowable European ancestor gets waved at for dramatic effect. The real picture is more specific than either of those, and more interesting because of it. There's Odessa Grady Clay's line, running back to a documented Irish immigrant named Abe Grady, who left Ennis in the 1860s and built a life and a family in Kentucky, a connection strong enough that generations later, an entire Irish town would throw open its doors for the homecoming. There's Cassius Clay's Senior's line, running back through Edith Greathouse to Archer Alexander, a man who was enslaved, who risked his life for other people's freedom, who became free himself, and whose image has stood in bronze in the nation's capital for over 150 years as a literal symbol of emancipation. And there's the name Clay itself inherited not from Archer Alexander's family, but from a completely different white Kentucky family, the one that had once enslaved Ali's ancestors on that side, which is exactly the kind of document of ownership Ali was talking about in 1964, whether or not he knew precisely who all the people underneath that name had been, put together. It's not a contradiction of what Ali stood for. It's closer to a confirmation of it, filled in with real names and real places that no courthouse record from the 1800s had ever been able to preserve. He rejected an inherited name because it represented ownership without consent. What genealogy and DNA later returned to his family wasn't a name at all, it was people. An Irish farmer's son who crossed an ocean and started over. A formerly enslaved man who risked everything to warn strangers of danger, then became, almost accidentally, the permanent image of freedom itself. Muhammad Ali spent his life demanding to be seen exactly as he was, completely on his own terms, with nothing left out. It turns out his own ancestry was asking for the same thing. He was a descendant of an Irish immigrant who built a new life 6,000 kilometers from home. He was a descendant of an enslaved man who became, quite literally, the face cast in bronze for American freedom. And he was, in the most complicated and specific sense that phrase allows, simply American, shaped by immigration, by slavery, and by generations of people whose names history nearly let slip away, until it didn't. The name he chose for himself in 1964 couldn't hold the entire truth of where he came from. No single name ever could. But for once, decades later, the record finally caught up and gave his family back the names it had spent so long trying to erase. As science uncovers the past, we're reminded that the greatest mystery has always been ourselves. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the secrets hidden within human history. Until then, stay curious and never stop asking what came before us.